Well, hello everyone. I know I haven't done a video in a while, but I watched some anime this past season and I figure I might as well talk about it. There's going to be one in particular that I'm going to talk about if you haven't noticed. But I did watch a handful of other shows this season, which is a lot more than I usually do. Normally when I decide what shows I want to watch per season, I'll look online for titles and posters that might pique my interest. Usually that eliminates like 90% of all shows. And this time I decided to watch 3 shows to start the season, and then I added 2 more as I went along. Jujutsu Kaisen is a show that a couple of people whose opinions I care about very deeply recommended to me. I should let you know that on the front end, I do not care in general about battle shonen or really fantasy shows in general, and I only gave this show a shot because I got the recommendation. I gave this show about 10 minutes, and then I turned it off. Which isn't terribly abnormal for me. I usually will give shows 10 minutes before deciding whether I want to continue or not, because I usually know pretty quickly when something isn't for me, and Jujutsu Kaisen is not for me. I'm not saying that it's bad, I'm saying that it's not a show meant for me, and I'm not going to give it a rating since I didn't give it a fair shot. I don't think it's fair to give any ratings to any shows that I didn't finish. Though there is a baseball episode late in the season, and I should probably check that out. I first read about 2.43 when someone online described it as a more depressing version of Haikyuu. And I don't really like Haikyuu, but I do like depressing stuff, and I figured that if this show would kind of be like Hoshai no Soda or Battery, then I would probably enjoy it. There definitely were a few things that I liked about it. I think the OP is fantastic and something that I still listen to. I really like the cryptic title, which refers to the height in meters of a professional volleyball net from the ground. And I also really like the setting. This show takes place in Hokkaido, which is naturally very cold and gray and very much different from the very colorful summer and serene atmospheres that we see in a lot of shows. In a way, it kind of reminded me of Wave Listen to Me, which was one of my favorite shows that came out last year. That was about all that I liked about the show, however. The rest of it was really boring and not terribly interesting, and honestly just reminded me too much of Haikyuu. I got midway through the 3rd episode before dropping it entirely, which was actually probably about 2.43 episodes. Whew, this is gonna be a tough one. So, I am not as high on the first season of The Promised Neverland as a lot of people were. I think the first season had a lot of conveniences and plot holes that I just couldn't get over, especially for a show that's about solving this puzzle. And also, it's gone terribly underreported, but this show is racist as hell. But I think the toughest thing about it was that I kept on comparing this show to Made in Abyss, which is a very similar show in tone, and also just much better in every single regard. I think the first season of The Promised Neverland is a good show. It's like a 7 out of 10. Thoroughly enjoyable, thoroughly good season of anime. But it wasn't even close to one of my favorites from even last year, and I wasn't really all that invested to watch the 2nd season at all. The only reason I did was because I decided to show the first season to my boyfriend, and he really liked it, and so we decided to watch the 2nd season together. As a result, I was not as emotionally invested in season 2 as a lot of people were, and I think this informs a lot of my opinions about season 2. For the record, I don't think season 2 was good. I think it was very bad. But I also think that the problems in season 2 were already apparent in season 1, or regarded the story that the TV production team had no hand in fixing. First off, the most fundamental problem of season 2, in my opinion, was that exploring the world beyond the walls of Grace Field was always going to be a problem. And that's not because it would have been impossible to create a world outside of Grace Field that was as intriguing as Grace Field was, but because the whole point of the appeal of the first season was that our kids were incarcerated. This is where the tension came from. This is where the horror of the story came from. The fact that all of our kids were trapped was the fundamental reason why the first season was such a success. Now that they're left to explore an open world, that tension is mostly released, and that's a huge problem for a show that is meant to be a thriller. And once the show got rolling, a whole bunch of problems started kicking in. My biggest issue with the plot conveniences was with the introduction of our Christ Child character, Mujika. Her role as the Christ Child didn't really make that much sense, and she's had about 700 years to fix this broken promise, and for some unexplored reason hasn't done it yet. I should point out that I have not read the manga and do not plan on reading the manga at all, but I also can't imagine what could have come from the manga that would have explained a lot of this mess. It seems like the production team did the best that they could with what I perceive to be a lackluster story. And it's almost as if the first season was such a success that it caught Studio Cloverworks by surprise, and they didn't have enough time to figure out a good plan for the second season. It seems as if a lot of the hatred directed towards season 2 of The Promised Neverland is focused on the last couple of episodes. And I didn't mind them as much as most people did because, as I mentioned before, I wasn't as emotionally invested from the beginning of the story as a lot of fans were. Really, once they sort of waved away Norman's attempt at a genocide, which I heard was an original storyline from the show, I had kind of given up on the idea that the show was going to make any sense anyway. So I can see why someone invested in the story would be upset at what amounted to a 3-minute montage of still images of a part of the story that could have encompassed an entire season's worth of show. But I didn't care. It was fine with me. I'd given up with the show by that point. Season 2 was bad, but it still did a lot of cool things that Season 1 also did. And for that reason, I give it a 6 out of 10. I think I gave the first season a 7 out of 10. A little bit better, not mind-blowing. This one, not as bad as some people might say. But if you think the first season was like tremendous and one of your favorite stories ever, maybe you want to watch out for the second season. Horimiya was the show that I had pegged from the start as the rom-com of the season that I would watch, based entirely off of the poster and the description. I was hoping the show would be better than the rom-com I chose from last season, Adachi and Shimamura. And it turned out to have very similar problems as Adachi and Shimamura, despite it being a very different show. So, on the front end, I think Horimiya has a very strong initial concept. I really enjoyed the idea of 2 teenagers needing to hide their actual self, one of them to protect their social standing while in school, and the other one just as a way of self-preservation after a history of trauma in school. I think it was really cool to watch these 2 souls find a mutual interest in each other, and even cooler to see them actually acting upon it early on. The scenes with Hori and Miyamura are easily the best part of the show. Them getting together by like the 4th or 5th episode was so refreshing, especially after watching Adachi and Shimamura kind of flounder in this gray area for the entirety of the show. But much like Adachi and Shimamura, Horimiya runs out of ideas really quickly. So the problem with getting your 2 lead characters early on in the show is, what do you do after that? And what Horimiya does is, instead of exploring our 2 main characters, it leans a little bit too heavily on its side characters and subplots. And the problem with this is that they are all dreadfully boring. I could not muster any interest in a single one of these subplots. And even if I did, the show didn't really spend that much time with them, so I couldn't have really gotten the satisfaction that I would have wanted anyway. The show does try a couple of things with Hori and Miyamura after they couple up, but they don't really have anywhere to go. They don't face any adversity, there's no real challengers to their love. They kind of just face a happily ever after midway through the show. The one cool thing that this show did with Hori and Miyamura is explore this like latent masochism within Hori. It led to some pretty interesting conversation online, but ultimately the show just kind of addresses it very sheepishly after an episode or 2 and then kind of forgets about it. I think Horimiya does best when it explores the taboo, but it doesn't explore the taboo well enough or long enough for it to be all that intriguing. And the worst part about Horimiya is that it is just not funny. This show tries a whole lot of jokes and I did not laugh once. I finished the show because it had enough going for it for me to be entertained week by week. Watching Hori and Miyamoto be a couple kind of, brought up some nice feelings. But I don't think I'm ever going to think about this show anymore after I'm done recording this. But also, the show has a fantastic OP, probably my favorite of the season so far. I also think the ED is really creative, even though it's not my favorite song. So maybe don't check out the show, but do check those out. We now get to Wonder Egg Priority. Wonder Egg Priority is hands down my favorite show of this season, and quite possibly one of my favorite shows of all time. Wonder Egg Priority is the reason why I watch anime. I kind of felt this way after watching Eizouken last year, where even if I have to sit through 9 or 10 shows per year that I'm not that interested in, as long as I get one Eizouken or one Wonder Egg Priority, then it makes the endeavor all worth it. I'm not going to spend too much time discussing the show itself. One, because there's way too much to go over, and two, I think I'd be really bad at it. I actually want to focus on the discourse that surrounded the show, because I actually found that just as interesting as the themes of the show itself. When the first episode of Wonder Egg Priority came out, a lot of the discussion that surrounded the show regarded this question of whether the quality of the first episode would continue throughout the series. A pretty common expression I would read online is this show going to stick the landing? And I found this really interesting because eventually there would be some concern about the quality of the show, but not for the reasons we thought of initially. Initially, people were concerned because they were so emotionally invested in the success of the show. A little bit of background, a lot of people that I follow online are young, identify as queer, and put a lot of stock into using anime to identify their place in the world. I do not. I personally don't care if any particular show is good or bad because I'm older and right now anime is kind of just television for me at this point. But I can definitely understand why someone who finds empowerment in the media they consume would want Wonder Egg Priority to succeed. And I can also understand why queer people who have watched anime for so long might be immediately skeptical of the cool gay show after being burnt so many times in the past. I'm not terribly offended by the queer baiting in Hibike Euphonium, but I know a lot of people that were. But what makes Wonder Egg Priority so special to me is that it isn't the cool gay show. It's the show that is cool by itself, that just happens to have characters that display these very familiar queer traits. I think there's a pretty decent chance that I would have loved this show even if it didn't have any of the gay stuff in it. I think Wonder Egg Priority has very bold messaging on depression and suicide. And I think it also has an excellent portrayal of gender roles and the people who don't quite fit into those roles. Not to mention, this show just looks absolutely incredible. Every scene in every episode is rendered so impeccably, it's almost impossible to tell that it had some production issues. The fight scenes made me care about fight scenes, and I usually do not care about fight scenes. Some of these shots are quite literally the most badass things I have ever seen in any TV anime, although granted I don't watch a whole lot of battle shonen. Also, not to mention, the soundtrack is A+. The songs are incredible, the score is fantastic, the music in Wonder Egg Priority just ugh. None of these qualities about the show require queerness to get into my good graces, which tells me that I probably would have enjoyed the show even if none of the gay shit had even happened. But the fact that our 4 main girls just so happen to embody these queer characteristics just makes the show that much more special to me, and hopefully for any queer audience member. It also makes it that much more difficult to read and hear about the horrific conditions that the production team had to go through just to get this anime finished. This brings me to the second narrative that I want to talk about, which is how Wonder Egg Priority reveals these very painful truths about the horrific conditions of the anime industry. I'm not going to pretend I know much about anime production that I didn't learn from Shirobako. And if you want to learn more about Wonder Egg Priority's horrific production stories, I'm going to place a link to a Sakuga blog post that is excellent and all-encompassing. But the gist of the narrative surrounding Wonder Egg Priority week to week went from, is this show going to stick the landing, to, is this show even going to finish at all? And even with a week off for a recap episode and 3 straight weeks of late deliveries, and also a special announced in June to wrap things up, whether it'll be a movie or an episode or 3 episodes, we don't know yet. I still think that Wonder Egg Priority gave its fans a complete show that is impossible to tell if it was rushed or not. And I know this isn't a new question, but I'm wondering what is the responsible thing that I can do as a consumer of this product. Do I not watch the show because of how much the industry grinds down its workers? Or do I watch it in deference of the creators who would probably want me to enjoy their creation? Do I vote with my dollar and only consume products from production studios that actually treat their workers well? And honestly, I would be just fine with watching nothing but Kyoto Animation shows for the rest of my life. It does bother me that one of my favorite shows of all time was made with the blood, sweat, and tears of its production team. And I think what also saddens me is that no matter how much noise is made about this, it's going to take a superhuman effort to give these production teams the basic workers' rights they deserve. And even after knowing about all of this going down in the middle of the season, I feel like such a hypocrite for wanting to watch how this show ends when it finally comes out in June. But if we divest this show from its production, what we have is what I believe to be a show that's going to last in the public discourse for a very long time, at least in the queer community. Wonder Egg Priority is a 10 out of 10 in my opinion, and the reasons are too numerous to name at this point. One of the best pieces of media analysis I ever heard was from the Anituber FKA Digi, who once said that the best pieces of media aren't the ones that do the least amount of bad, but the ones that do the most amount of good. And Wonder Egg Priority is not without its flaws. I will be the first to admit that there are some slower episodes, there are some points that don't make a lot of sense, and there are some themes that I wish they had explored with a little bit more sympathy. But the good things that the show does so overwhelmingly overshadow the bad things that the bad things are completely erased from my head. I'm probably going to do another video in June when the finale comes out to properly express how much I really, really adore this show. But for now, I'll just say that it's the best seasonal show I've seen since Sangatsu no Lion, and Sangatsu no Lion is probably my favorite show of all time. So if I leave you with one thing, it's skip everything from this winter season, watch Wonder Egg Priority first. I'm hoping to do this once a season, and so I'll probably see you again with something like this in 3 months.